Hey everyone, welcome back to the React in-depth series. I'm super excited about this video. In this one, we're going to go over JSX and how elements get created inside of React using createElement. This is a super important topic. I actually decided to split it up into a totally separate video before we jump into components, which is going to be the next video, because really understanding what JSX is and actually the kind of fundamentals and actually the why of why we even need JSX in the first place is so central to understanding React and even other frameworks that it really deserves its own video. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Let's get right into it. Okay, so to start, JSX, you might have heard this before, but like what really is this JSX thing? So React, as I showed in the intro video, actually uses this new type of syntax that kind of combines a few concepts together, specifically HTML and CSS, HTML and JavaScript. Technically you can use CSS in there as well, but really it's a kind of conglomerate of HTML and JavaScript so that we can actually extend JavaScript to include some HTML inside of it. That's where the name actually comes from, and it was originally created by I believe it was created by the React developers to actually have an extra tool alongside React to make writing in React a lot easier. So that's a lot of words. Let's actually take a look at what it really means. So JavaScript by itself is its own language and its own syntax. The developers that created JSX realized that we need to extend this in order to add extra functionality that's not part of JavaScript itself, hence the name JSX, which stands for JavaScript Syntax Extension. The X is for the extension part. So it's an extension of the JavaScript syntax so we can actually write this HTML and other things inside of there that is not part of the vanilla JavaScript syntax itself. So you can think of JSX as if JavaScript and HTML actually had a baby, out would pop kind of JSX, which is what we're going to be working with quite a lot throughout this course and even in other frameworks and languages as well. It allows us to write HTML inside of our JavaScript, which is really the most important part, but also allows us to actually write JavaScript expressions inside of the HTML, which is inside of the JSX. It's kind of like like the joke of like, would you like some HTML in your JavaScript inside of your HTML inside of your JavaScript? So that's kind of like what JSX is. It allows us to really mishmash these two kind of languages into one place so we can have everything in one place. But really the point of this video and understanding JSX is the question why, right? Why does any of this even matter? And why did we even go in this direction in the first place? So I'd like to kind of go down that route because actually understanding the why of this is pretty central to understanding why we even need JSX, how it's used, and how even other languages take advantage of it, and kind of why it may or may not be the right direction to go. And I'll leave that as an exercise to you to think about once we're done this together. So to start, I kind of just want to go over a tiny bit of history just so this makes more sense for context. Originally, back in the day, and even today you can still do this, we would have HTML, which is what I have here on the left of the screen, and JavaScript, which is what I have here on the right of the screen. HTML is a templating language. It basically tells the program that's reading the HTML how to display things on the screen. For example, the browser would read HTML and be like, oh, this is the web page that I'm going to show you, or the email that I'm going to show you, an email program, etc., etc. JavaScript is the logic that dictates how those components on the HTML actually interact with JavaScript, so we can actually have logic and business logic and other things happen so that we can make our HTML basically dynamic and actually do things. Because traditionally, if you think about how HTML works, for example, if we just had like a button or a paragraph, we couldn't do things like fetch things from the server easily. We can't like show modals, so we can't do things like logging in and out. We can't do really any of that without any JavaScript logic because HTML by default is just a templating languages, which is to say that it actually only shows us how to actually show stuff on the screen. So traditionally what we had was separate markup, which is HTML, from the logic, which is the JavaScript on the right. So if we wanted to add any kind of dynamism to our programs, and actually have them do things. For example, let's say we wanted to make this H1 do stuff. We would actually have to use JavaScript, for example, like this. We would, in the case of a browser, reach into the DOM and grab that H1 and add an event listener to it. So now that we can actually run some code when, for example, that thing actually runs. I just realized that technically this is wrong. I should probably have something like say click, for example, in there, and then we would call login. But you kind of get the gist. Hopefully that makes sense. let's take a look at kind of the evolution of this when we actually realized that we wanted to do this kind of stuff, but a little bit easier and maybe have it a bit more dynamic than traditionally splitting out the two. That led to kind of this paradigm, which actually wasn't too long ago. We had this idea of templating languages. This, in fact, is still used quite a lot today in different contexts, but it's definitely not the kind of forefront of, like, for example, front-end development or even templating on the back end these days. So a template is what I have here on the left-hand side. This, I have to stress this enough, it is not HTML and it's not JavaScript. If you take a really close look at this code here I have in the orange, you'll see why that is, right? Because, I mean, technically you could put this in HTML, but this would literally show these brackets and name without actually name being filled in. So a template language allowed us to basically write separate files that would get parsed or read by another program that would go in and fill in these variables with things from something else like JSON or JavaScript or some other language, right? So for example here, if I had name as monkey, I could actually make this HTML actually spit out welcome monkey in that paragraph tag once it gets parsed by that program. There are many templating languages out there. For example, I think I've used ones like Pug was one. There's like Handlebars. There's a whole bunch of different templating languages out there. And some of these are still used today. Very common. They're still used, for example, in email programs to actually format HTML inside of emails. So this worked quite well. The only challenge was really that this is mainly for static content. We couldn't create dynamic apps for this. If you look at this template here, we can't like add event listeners easily to this thing. There's a whole bunch of extra stuff that we'd have to do to actually make it dynamic. And usually that would just involve JavaScript that we'd add on the front end, for example. So really this was mainly for static things, at least at the start. And then eventually people evolved this concept to do things that were dynamic, but they all included their own kind of syntax. And they're all very different from each other. And in order to use one, you had to kind of learn its syntax, and use the other one, you had to learn its syntax. And there was no real good standard for how these worked. So that worked for quite a while, and that was kind of the way to do things. But the developers that created React realized like maybe there's like a better, more standardized way to do this that kind of merges these concepts together in such a way that it just kind of makes sense, but it's more standardized as well. So everyone can kind of use it. And they made the really smart decision to not necessarily tie it directly to React. JSX actually has nothing really to do with React, which is why it's really awesome. Other languages and frameworks and I should say libraries actually are able to use JSX without actually using React, right? So JSX is just being parsed separately, and then the language or the UI library or whatever it is that's using that can actually use it however it likes, which is why we see a lot of modern frameworks and libraries like Svelte or Remix or what have you. A lot of them, I actually don't remember if Svelte uses it, but a lot of modern ones do use JSX behind the scenes. Now, there's definitely still a back and forth on this. There's kind of the crowd that likes the very standardized way of writing HTML. I think actually Svelte is one of those. And then there's ones that kind of use a higher level abstraction like JSX so that we can easily write these things and put JavaScript alongside our HTML. Now, which way is the right way? I don't actually know. There's pros and cons to both and trade-offs for both ways. I like standards, but at the same time, I think we should be able to develop apps quickly and have fun with it and efficiently. So it's really a tough decision, but most languages are actually comfortable with using a basic form of JSX at least. So that's why it's important to realize that this is separate from React, but it's going to be so central to understanding React that we're going to cover it in this series, but as a separate video as we're doing right now. So let's come to how this all kind of ties together. JSX allows us to really put together that logic and the actual template together. That's really the core point of JSX. Previously, these were separate, or we had to learn a very specific kind of language to make this kind of work properly, and it was a bit janky. But JSX makes it much easier to understand because it's really just HTML with a little bit of JavaScript sprinkled into it. So over here, for example, you can see that I have some functions in JavaScript kind of in the blue, like login and log out and show mode. I'll even have a variable called name over here. And in the yellow, right below this, in the same file, alongside this JavaScript, I have JSX. Technically, this entire thing is JSX because it kind of goes together. But really, when I'm talking about JSX, I'm talking about this yellow part over here. This actually looks like HTML, almost, right? There is some funky stuff going on in here. For example, onClick. That looks a little suspect because onClick in HTML is all lowercase and it doesn't really look like that. There's usually strings around it. This has this weird curly bracket stuff going on, but you can kind of look at this and be like, huh, okay, I kind of get it. Like it says home in it and then you click it and maybe you log in. And then same with welcome over here, right? You can see that this is not really valid HTML per se because name would just come out as actually literally name. But here we're saying welcome monkey instead because monkey is actually being put in that variable inside the JSX dynamically. So this JSX allows us to put together the markup and the logic into one place. And on top of that, and this is really critical, it allows us to have dynamic content for kind of one of the first times as well. So we can have an on-click listener, for example, just in here, just as we would inside of the HTML. There's a lot of stuff that has to happen on the front end for this to work or on the back end for this to work. And to get into the details of that is definitely beyond the scope of this video. And I'd like to get to it in future videos. But if you can look at this and get the gist of what's happening and how this is fundamentally different from both this concept where we have just templates and this concept where everything was separate, you're in a good place. And that's really as far as we need to go for now to understand how this works. Okay, so what does this have to do with React? Well, this is what I want to show you here. And I'm going to give you a couple of cool tools to actually take a look at this. And we're going to write a bit of code together to actually explore this a little bit deeper as well. So on the left here, I have quote unquote JSX, okay? Technically, this is actually HTML, right? Because if you look at this, you're like, okay, well, no, thanks. That's like, H1 tag and it has hello in there. But really, we can also write this in JSX. So when we do that, specifically in the context of JSX, specifically in the context of React, React will take that JSX and transform it into a function call to create a regular element out of it, which is what I'm showing on the right. So this gets translated for the most part, again, depending on how new a version of React you're using and some other things, but generally speaking, it gets translated into this function call right here. React.createElement, we're creating an H1, and then we're giving it what are called props, which we'll get into in a future video, but mainly we're giving it the child, the inner text in this case, which is going to be hello, the string hello. So that's all it is, right? And this is very similar, for the most part, to how we create elements in the regular DOM through JavaScript and HTML anyways. So that's pretty cool, right? Really, you can think of it as there's a program running behind the scenes that will take our JSX and turn it into these function calls to spit out the actual HTML for us. So we can actually think like this instead of thinking like this. That is really the core breakthrough in technologies like JSX, and this is why they're called abstractions, so that we can actually work in a declarative and higher level fashion and worry about the details a lot less, because they don't really matter that much at the end of the day unless you're trying to do some really crazy stuff. So again, this JSX gets parsed and transformed into these function calls, and then these functions get transformed into regular DOM changes as well. Okay, so we'll look at a bit of that process later on once we get into how kind of the components get rendered and things like that in the components videos that we have coming up. But for JSX, this is really great. So I want to show you a couple of examples here, and I'm going to pull up a program, and then we're going to write some code. So up here, I again have some HTML or JSX, right? Let's just pretend it's JSX for now. This is valid JSX. This here is also valid JSX. You can see that I added an attribute to this JSX node called ID equals main. This is what's really magical and beautiful, actually, if you think about it, about JSX. If I showed you this, or if I showed you this, you actually don't know if I'm talking about HTML or I'm talking about JSX, which is pretty awesome. That's kind of the point, right? We shouldn't have to think like, oh, like, am I writing in JSX or am I writing HTML? Like, is it like a special p tag I have to use? No, just use a regular p tag, regular spans, regular H1. There are some extra things that we can do, but at its core, HTML just works as you would expect it to, including nesting the HTML, which is absolutely fantastic, as it should, because we don't need to think about the details here. We should actually just use the languages that we're used to, which is really nice. Now, there are some subtle differences that we have to be aware of. Keep in mind, JSX is JavaScript extended, right? So at its core, it's JavaScript and not HTML, which means that we have some differences in how some of the wordings for specific things are done. For example, right here, I have a class name attribute in JSX, which translates to the class attribute in HTML. Notice that class name is camel-cased and regular class in HTML is just all lowercase. So you might be thinking, well, that's bizarre. What's the point of this? Now I have to start remembering class name versus class, etc., etc. I thought you said like the whole point is to not worry about this stuff. Well, the challenge is that as much as we would love that, things like if you think about how JavaScript works, the word class itself is a reserved word in JavaScript, right? Class means literally I want to create a class object for object-oriented programming or prototypical inheritance in JavaScript, right? So we can't actually use this, just like we can't use words like for and if and things like that, because they actually mean something in the JavaScript language, even though they don't necessarily mean something in HTML. This is very similar to how in HTML, the tag names actually mean something, and each of them is very specifically coded to do a specific thing. Okay, so that also translates over and tracks to a lot of things. For example, onClick would look like this over here instead of like this in HTML. Very similar, so most of the time it's just camel case. It's not true for all things, but it is true for most things. And don't worry about these rules too much. Honestly, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. As we get better with this and get more practice with JSX and writing components, this will become more natural to you and it'll just make more sense. And even if you do make a mistake, you'll be able to correct it pretty quickly. So memorizing, absolutely a no-no. Definitely, in fact, I would encourage you not to memorize this stuff. You're just going to get a hang of it over time. And as you make mistakes, that's totally fine. Just be aware that there are reserved words that we can't use in JavaScript specifically. And most of the time we have to use these weird kind of camel cases to get around it. And these are some examples, and there are a couple of others as well. Okay, so most importantly, again, before we get to some demos really quick, I just want to show you two last things. Inside of JSX, another huge superpower is the ability to insert dynamic JavaScript expressions inside the template language itself. What does that mean? That all sounded probably like a bunch of mumbo jumbo. Imagine I have JavaScript up here. I have a variable, I should probably put like let or const or something, but just imagine I have name equals Layla, right? If I wanted to, I could actually do this. I could write this in JSX and have a paragraph tag that says hello, and then these curly brackets, and then any JavaScript expression inside of those curly brackets. Now I highlighted expression because that actually means something fundamentally different from any JavaScript code. Expression you can think of at a very high level as being kind of like a one-line statement, right? We can't have like an entire like regular for loop in here because that's a bunch of lines with curly brackets and a whole bunch of other stuff in there. Now we can do loops in creative ways using expressions, but we'll get a better handle for what this means and its difference from regular JavaScript code in a second. An expression really is kind of like a short one-liner kind of thing that is one single statement that is not like a multi-line of code for the most part. There are ways around this, and generally we want to keep it as simple as possible in the JSX, and we'll look into some ways that we can do that when we actually get to writing components together later. So at its core, we can put JavaScript inside these curly brackets and it will kind of just work. So this and this actually get translated into this DOM element once it gets parsed by JSX or React in this case, and it's actually going to spit out a regular paragraph node with the text content of Layla, which is super awesome. You can imagine in the future, as we kind of get better at this, we can, we learn more React functions, we can imagine changing Layla. For example, I change it to my name, Nader, and this would automatically change this paragraph to have my name inside of it instead of Layla, which would be super, super awesome. That's much easier than doing all the kind of inner HTML text content, appending, clearing of nodes, all that kind of stuff. Okay. Now, I want to show you that more complicated example as an expression really quick before we actually look at how this actually works behind the scenes. Imagine we have, I didn't use const or let here again. I'm going like Python style, I guess. We have names, and it's an array of strings, right? So we have David, Jabari, Akira in here as names. This, again, imagine that this is in JSX. I don't actually have to put this inside of directly like a div or something like that. Right? Like, let's walk through this code really quick, and we'll see more examples as we get more practice with React. I just want to show you an example of a more complex expression in JavaScript and kind of the purpose of it and what it would do. Let's say that we map through this. If you're confused about map, I have a video on map on the JavaScript series on the channel as well, so take a look at that. But we're going to loop through each of these. We get the name, and for each name, we're going to return JSX. This is really critical. Each name is going to be dynamically put into its own paragraph tag with the actual name. And we're going to end up with 3 paragraphs in this particular example of David first, then Jabari, then Akira, all in their own paragraph tags using this code with this names array. Okay, now that is really awesome. Why is this awesome? Well, because really, at the end of the day, there's nothing special about this apart from the fact that we just have some kind of HTML sprinkled into our JavaScript. Really, the only special part here is this part right here, where we're using JSX instead of either HTML or JavaScript. Before JSX, this would probably have to be a string that we returned, and then we would have to do something like inner HTML or clean up the HTML or something and then put it into the DOM. But luckily, React can handle all that, or in this case, JSX can handle most of that for us, and we can just kind of think of it at a more declarative way at a higher level and say, I want 3 paragraphs. Each paragraph should have a name in it, and these are the 3 names I want in there. And then you kind of figure out how to make that into actual HTML for me. Okay, pretty cool, right? All right, so before we jump into VS Code, I do want to show you a little bit of how this works behind the scenes because it's pretty important to understand what JSX is actually doing. So I encourage you to open up your browser, go to Google, and now there are 2 tools that we can really use to take a look at this. The first one is Babel. So Babel.js, I guess. So if you Google for Babel.js, you'll see this. You might have heard of this before. It's a tool that's used behind the scenes to translate our code into older versions of JavaScript that are kind of cross-platform or more robust across different versions of the browser, like Internet Explorer or Edge and things like that. So you can do this in Babel. And if you click on Babel.js, in the very top right here, there's like a try it out section, and you can write some code in here. I would encourage you to actually redo the examples I'm going to show you in another tool inside of Babel and see the small differences because it's really important to see how it actually works behind the scenes. I'm going to actually show you this in another tool, SWC. Which is not the Sir Winston Churchill. I'm going to say SWC and I'll say JS, just so it's super clear what this is. The SWC is a Rust-based, I guess like transpiler technically, to do basically what Babel does, but much faster because it uses Rust as a backend. And a lot of modern tools use this like Next.js and Dino, etc. So if we click on actually this website, which is the SWC website, you can read through it. You can even see their claim, a little race car over here, 20 times faster. That's quite a claim than Babel. And 70 times faster. Well, those are large numbers. I don't know where they get those from. I'd love to see those benchmarks. That sounds kind of cool. It kind of checks out, I guess. Over here in the top right, they have a playground as well. And again, I encourage you to do this both in the SWC website as well as the Babel website. So what is this tool and why is it important? I want to show you how React sees our JSX and really what that means for us so that we can conceptualize and debug our code much easier as we go deeper into writing different kinds of components. Because fundamentally, JSX is used across different tools, not only React, and it really is used in a similar way across all these tools. And understanding kind of how it works is really central to making sure that there's less bugs as you use it. So on the left side here, I'm just going to check off the JSX option so that this actually understands that we're trying to write JSX. I believe in Babel, they have a preset for React here on the left side, so you can probably just check that one instead. But as I said, I'm going to write this in SWC. There's going to be some small differences between the two, which are not really important for what we're doing right now. So I'm going to write a function here. And I'm going to call this function home. Okay. Now, this is just a regular JavaScript function, right? As you can see, just regular JavaScript. This function takes no arguments and returns undefined, right? Pretty boring. But take a look at this. Inside of here, I would like to return a div. And I'm going to have an empty div in here, just like that. Now, you cannot write this code inside of JavaScript by default. Okay, why? Because this here, these tokens, right, just angle bracket of div and angle bracket div, etc., is not valid JavaScript. Okay, so we can't, let me zoom in even more here so we can really see this a bit clearer. We can't write this normally in a JavaScript file. We would get a syntax error. Okay, however, with a JavaScript extended or JSX file, if the program knows that we're writing JSX, it can actually translate that into valid JavaScript so that it does run properly. So what JSX is doing behind the scenes, and in this case, React's version of JSX, is actually this code over here on the right. It's actually turning this line into this line. And what is this line doing? Well, it's using React.createElement, which is a regular JavaScript function from the React library, and it's creating a div and it's passing in null, whatever that means. Okay, so that is pretty cool. I mean, that seems like it makes sense. Like, this is definitely valid JavaScript. Do we know what this function does? No, not really, but it definitely looks like valid JavaScript. It definitely looks better than this when it comes to actually the JavaScript engine trying to run it. Let's create another function here. I'm gonna call this one navbar. And that's gonna be a function like that. And inside of this navbar, let's just return another tag. Let's return a p tag, but this time I'm going to put some text inside of it, like we normally would expect. So I'm going to put like welcome, right? And I'll even put a little exclamation in there. Okay, so again, if we look at this function on the left and we just focus on that, this is absolutely not valid JavaScript. JavaScript would be very unhappy if it saw this code right here. It's going to be like, what are you doing to me? Please clean this up so I understand it, right? Luckily, we have JSX, and JSX in React, in this case, knows to actually call React.createElement, and in other UI libraries or frameworks, it would call their version of this, but behind the scenes, it's fundamentally the same code. In fact, if you see Babel, it'll actually use the underlying primitive for this, which is just the JSX function itself. But effectively, it does the same thing. This calls a React.createElement, but there's a small change here. We're creating a p tag, and then we're passing in null for this value and then welcome. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. So we can actually kind of see how this translates across, right? So there are some things in here that are being changed. I want to show you something else. Let's say that I put a span in here right after this welcome, and I'll put like maybe let's put an emoji in here. Why not? I'll put a rocket. Right? And then I'll close the span. Okay, so now we have quite a lot kind of happening all at once. We have a p tag, and right after this, we have a span, but still inside of the p tag itself. So it's nested inside of the p tag. Okay, so let's see what that translates to. Over here on the right side, we can see that this is React.createElement of a p tag, but now what we're seeing is that we have like another thing over here where it's React.createElement span, and then it's kind of doing the same thing over and over again. And this, if you're confused about what this is just a Unicode representation of this emoji, which is just text. So if I say like to the moon like that, you'll see that this actually translates to the Unicode version of that, and then our text right after it. Okay, so really what's happening is React is basically recursively going through this tree that we're creating, which is really a DOM tree, and calling createElement for every single thing inside of there and creating different types of nodes for our HTML. Okay, now I want to show you one last thing really quick before we actually dive into VS Code, where I can show you some kind of a bit more of kind of how this object actually works. So I don't want to go too far into this because we're actually going to get into this entire concept in a separate video, but this is called component composition, and you don't need to understand what is happening here. I just want to show you how this works so when we see it later, and we will absolutely get into this in depth, it will make more sense. Since this function here, this navbar element, actually returns JSX, what we can actually do is this. Inside of this div, I'll just put it on separate lines so it's a bit cleaner to read. I can actually do this. I can say navbar, just like that, okay? Now, again, we're not going to get into this right now. We'll see this as we build components and as we get to component composition specifically. But I just want you to imagine that this is calling the navbar function to basically take this and copy and paste it up here. That's really what's happening. But to really show you what's cool about this is let's take a look back here on the right-hand side. What this is being translated into once JSX parses it is another React element call here, but we're going to be calling this navbar function. So that's the child of this div node is just navbar, which is exactly what it is. If you look at it, that kind of makes sense, right? We have a div, and then the child of that div is this navbar, right? And what is JSX going to do in this case? Well, it's going to look for navbar, and it's going to see that it returns this, which it's going to execute and then kind of copy and paste it into this part of the tree, the DOM tree. Okay, so if we were to add another child in here, for example, let's add just another paragraph tag, and I'll just put hello, just like that. What we'll see is that this just gets added as a regular tag, a p tag, because that's a regular DOM node, but then this one is special because it is actually a function call for more JSX, which eventually will resolve at some point to regular HTML elements. At the end of the day, this entire tree needs to result in just regular, vanilla HTML elements like p tags and h1s and spans and all that kind of stuff. We can do this as a convenience as long as those things eventually will return their own vanilla DOM nodes. So that's pretty cool. Notice that this is not a hello like component per se. This is just hello written inside of a p tag. This is an actual function that we need to call, which will basically take this and copy and paste it up over here. Okay. Now, I want to show you one thing in VS Code really quick. I'm going to pull out VS Code, and I opened a folder already. I encourage you to do the same. I'm going to run npm in my terminal in this folder, create, and I'm going to do vite at latest. Actually, I always forget what comes after this, so I'm just going to run that. I think it's going to actually ask me for the project name, so I'll just say my app, and then it's going to say select a framework. You can see all the different frameworks in here. We're going to be using React. Then it's going to say, okay, do you want to use TypeScript and all this kind of stuff? You can see the SWC, which is what I just showed you. I believe not by default. I'm not actually sure which one it uses by default. I think you can still use, I think this is Babel. I don't actually know. I'm just going to use regular JavaScript there. And then it's going to say, I can do this to actually run the app. So I'm going to cd into my app. I'm going to npm install. I is just a shortcut there for install. And while that's doing that, I'm going to open up this component over here. And what we'll see is app.jsx and main.jsx, right? So now hopefully you can actually see that there is a little bit of connection between what we just saw that I showed you and what we're seeing over here. We're having app, which is component composition, but we're putting app in here. But more importantly, inside of app, this is where all the stuff that we're interested in is. We can ignore the state for now, but you can kind of see, right? All of this is just JSX. Now, this is a special tag called a fragment. But if we ignore that for now, what we can see is that all of this other stuff is just regular HTML for the most part. There are things, like I mentioned, that are camel case in here, class name, for example, on click, right? We can't have those be as just class, because if I try to get rid of this and I say class equals that, we'll actually get an error because class actually means something in JavaScript. So the compiler will get really confused. So we have to put it as class name. And same with many of the other things like on-click. So that is kind of how all of this works. What I do want to show you though is a bit about how this actual create element actually works. So what I'll do is let's do this in the console inside of app. So over here, let me just at the very, very top, I'm going to, from React, I'm also going to import, I'm going to put a comma beside use state, and I'm going to import create element, which is that function that we just saw from React, right? So beside use state, I'm going to import create element, and I'll say const el, I'll just say for element is equal to create element, and let's just create a p tag just like that. And I'll say inside the p tag, I'm going to put an object. So there are many ways to use this function. I think initially when I learned this, we could actually pass an object in here, which are what are called props, which we'll see in the next video. I'm just going to put children, and I'll just put hello there. Okay, and I'll save that file. So this is telling React to create an element, which is a p tag, and its children are going to be a text in this case, which just says hello there. So this is basically saying to create a p tag with hello there inside of the p tag. Now we could have done this way as well. So the const L2 is equal to p hello there, just like that as well. So I'll show you that these are both the exact same thing. So I'll do that really quick, and then I'll actually show you what is inside of this to wrap up the video. So where should we put this? Let's see. Let's put it at the very bottom of the page. Why not? So we have EL and EL2. So I'll scroll to the very bottom of this page right here after this p tag, and I'm going to put in here, I have to put in some curly brackets for EL. And we'll see a bit of why this is the case when we get to the component video, but we have to actually put this as a JavaScript variable and evaluate it as a variable here. And EL2, since it's already JSX, we don't actually need to do that. So we can, actually we do, sorry. We have to do that here as well. I always get confused with this stuff. As you can see, even I get confused all the time. We have to evaluate both of them and put them in here as expressions. So this looks kind of weird, right? These are not like p tags or h1 tags or any of that kind of stuff. This is just JavaScript variables. Okay, if I had no curly brackets here, let's see what happens if I do npm. Let me just run dev to actually get this up and running, and I open this in my browser here. What we'll see is EL2 as actual text. Okay, so let me zoom in a tiny bit more, so hopefully you can see that right here. If I right click and I inspect this, it should pop up in my elements tab. Nope, it doesn't. Let me just select it again, EL2. It's not going to show. There it is. It's a text node, right? And right above it is our paragraph node. But it's actually a paragraph being wrapped correctly, but below that is a text node. So if I switch back here and I change this to actually evaluating that as a JavaScript expression, and I save this, and then I flip back, what we'll see is now both of these are working as we'd expect as actual paragraph tags that are being evaluated by JSX and being parsed correctly. Okay, so these two are now both functionally equivalent, EL and EL2, which are, let me just close this over here, these ones right here, EL and EL2. This is manually creating the element and passing in the type and then the children, and this is creating it using JSX. Hopefully you can agree that even for as simple an example as just a simple paragraph tag, this is much nicer than this. But behind the scenes, as we saw in the playground earlier for SWC, and you will see for Babel as well, this is actually what gets created when it's actually being run through the compiler. Okay. Now, as these get much more complicated, this expression becomes more and more untenable and complicated to manage, which is why JSX exists, because you can imagine there's like 100 child nodes in here. That would become almost impossible, and the amount of brackets would be totally crazy to try to create it with this element. You're almost certain to run into some issues. Now, I do want to show you something cool here. I'm going to put inside a console.log. I'm going to do object.entries of EL just to see what's inside of there. And I'm going to do the same thing for EL 2. Okay, so I'm going to save that, and I'm going to switch back to Chrome. And I'm going to pull up the console here. And it does run twice, and we'll see a bit of kind of why that happens. In my case, it actually runs 4 times because I have DevTools installed, but I will get into more of this as we look at how components work. But really open up any of these. It doesn't really matter too much. These first 2 is what I'm going to open because these are the 2 console logs. This second one is coming from my DevTools. But these are actually the keys and the type of object that is being created when we call createElement, either from JSX or from the actual createElement function itself. And they are the same, right? Because they're literally the same thing. This version is the exact same thing as this version once it actually gets parsed out by the JSX engine. So what's inside of there? Well, we can see there's a symbol, and this shows us that this is actually the type of this element is a React element, and the JSX engine actually uses this, and React uses this specifically to render different types of things differently in its tree. You can see there's a type. In this case, it's a p tag. Everything gets a key and a ref, and this thing called props, which is an object. You can see in this case, if I open that up, it has one thing in there, which is children of hello there. Right? So that's pretty cool. We'll look at an entire video on how props work, as well as kind of this component composition idea with props later on. Then there's some other things in there that are kind of normally hidden, like owner and store and things like that. We're going to be looking at almost all of these for the most part, but it is important to notice that these 2 are actually exactly the same thing, and there are things in those objects that is used by React to kind of figure out what to do with these nodes behind the scenes, both when translating from JSX to the actual createElement calls and the actual createElement calls to the DOM nodes. You can imagine if I was to give you this object right here, this exact object, I could actually construct the correct DOM node using this object, using the regular vanilla DOM API, because I know the type of this thing is P, and I know that it has a children of a text node in this case. So I would just do document createElement P, and then I would say P and then append a text node to it of hello there, which is actually exactly what we're seeing over here. That's literally what's being actually finally inserted into the DOM in the final version of this parsing. All right. Now, I hope that was valuable to you. I know there was quite a lot to digest. I hope you have fun playing in those playgrounds. Definitely try out different versions of the calls and different versions of JSX and even combining them together just to get a bit of practice. What we're going to do in the next video is finally start building our first component. I was debating whether to make exercises for this or not, but I think it makes more sense to actually build our first components and then start building exercises after that. So I can't wait to get to that video where we start building our first components in React together. We're going to build stateless components first, so not worrying about any of the state stuff. And then we're going to learn some more concepts before we can actually learn how state works inside of components. So we're going to build up to more complicated components. If you liked this video, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear in the comments what you thought of this entire process. Is there anything in here that's still confusing to you or that you have questions about? Definitely hit me up in the comments and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible, or you can join the Discord to see if other people can also help out alongside myself. So until the next video where we actually start building some of these components together, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.